In this recording, I'm talking about Bonaventure's journey of the mind to God, and I'm looking at steps 5 and 6. So, step 5 is called the consideration of the divine unity through its primary name, which is being. And then step 6 is the consideration of the most blessed Trinity in its name, which is the good. So, um, we've seen that in steps 1 and 2. So, I will draw my stick figure here. Right. So the first couple of steps where you looked at the external world, the world outside of you, through your physical senses, and that was those provided the signpost for God, right? And so that's the first step in the journey to God. And then steps 3 and 4 were this introspective journey, with introspective journeys into the mind. Now, why the mind? It's because the mind, human beings are made in the image of God, okay, and um, the image of God is found most ideally in the mind. At least that's in this typical medieval Catholic theology. So after we've taken these 2 steps, at this stage we've sharpened our spiritual senses, okay? And now it's time to begin to look directly at God. Okay, and there's 2 stages to this. So it's in step 5, um, we're going to look at God, and the first thing we'll see about God is that um, God is being. Okay, all right, and then in step 6, we'll see that after we see God as being, then that leads us to seeing God as the good. And this automatically implies then God is Trinity. And Trinity just means that God is a Trinity of persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, so that's in a nutshell steps 5 and 6. So I am going to say just a little more. All right, so going back to step 5, just to just expound a little more on what I just presented. All right. So, in the first thing we realize after we've studied the image of God in ourselves and the reformed image of God in ourselves, and we begin to look directly towards God, we focus on being. Okay, and so let's put that in quotes. Okay, so think of being as it's hard to think of it as a noun, okay, but also in verb-like connotations. Okay, so we focus on being, something called we're calling being, and he says, so we realize, okay, that being this thing, okay, he says, is so absolutely certain, okay, that it cannot be thought not to be. All right, so what does that mean? He's saying essentially that if you think about being, and when you think of God as being, so um, think about God as existing, okay, as absolutely existing, right? Just put a space here so we know that's something else. So when you think of God as absolutely existing, you think about God, or you just think about being. Let's just think about being. What you realize is that there has to be something that exists, and you cannot think of it as not existing. Okay, so you can ask the question, is it possible that nothing, that there be nothing, right? So let's try that. Is it possible that there be nothing? Absolutely nothing. So you notice that that's a very hard concept to even conceive. So when I think of nothing, I think of an empty room, or I might think of the darkness of space. But that's not nothing, right? I'm just thinking of something that's empty. But we know there's stuff there. Anything that's a place is a thing, right? Essentially, if there can be something there, then it's not nothing. So nothing's just absolute nothing, nothing, nothing at all. And is it possible that there be nothing? No, that's not possible. And why? Because we're here, right? Um, that means it's possible that I exist because I do exist. And if it's possible that I exist, then it's not possible then, and it's possible that you exist, and it's possible that your iPod, your iPhone exists, then it's not possible that there be nothing, right? Because we're here. So the fact is that you can't think of non-existence, okay? Right? It's just not possible, and that's what he's saying is that being is so absolutely certain that it cannot be thought not to be. You can't think of non-existence. It just is not there. He says you can think when you think try to think of nothing or non-existence. You usually think of something and then you think them away, right? Which sort of shows that the character of nothing is that you're trying to it's more of a privation. You're trying to remove something to create nothing, and by doing that, you've already established that there is something. Okay, so he's saying that being is so absolutely certain that it cannot be thought not to be. Now, the thing here is that you and I are not necessary beings. That means, so even though we are here, we exist, and it's possible that we exist, and that can never be taken away ever. We're not necessary beings. That means we don't. It's not necessary that we exist. Okay, so if my parents, your parents, did not have us, right, then we wouldn't exist, and the world could still go on, right? You think of whatever state, state of Connecticut or um, anything, right? Is that we're not necessary beings, right? The tree in your front yard or outside didn't have to exist. Okay, but can everything be like this, right? Can everything be something that was not necessary? No, right? There has to be something that is necessary, that does exist, right? So you and I are not necessary beings. Our existence depends on something else. Okay, but Bonaventure is saying is that there is a being that does not depend on anything to exist. Okay, and this being, he says, is God, right? So this being is necessary being. Okay, and everything else is contingent. Okay, contingent is the word contingent to say that something's not necessary. Everything is, when you say it's contingent, that means it depends on something else. Okay, so Bonaventure is saying that this is the first thing you notice about being, that it's so absolutely certain, it cannot be thought not to be. It necessarily exists. Okay, and so of course God is this necessary being. And so when you've gone from reflecting on the nature of the world as a vestige, and then you've reflected on um, the nature of God in the image of God that's in us. You've done the internal reflection, and now you begin to look up towards God. The first thing you are convinced of, that you will see, is that God is being, and God necessarily exists. Okay, and that this means that everything else depends on God to exist, but God is. So he says God is the source of all and is uncreated and prior to everything. Okay, so that's what step 5 is about, establishing that once you in this step of the ascent, that's the first thing that's what grips you about God. Okay, and it's this idea that God is necessary being. Now it's step 6. You're now looking at God, and step 6 takes you a step further, right? So you see something in step 6 that you couldn't see in step 5. So in step 6, what you see is that when you're considering God as being, you see that the characteristic most fundamental to the notion of being is the good. So the characteristic most fundamental to being is the good. Okay, so nothing can be greater than this idea of the good, that being is inherently good. So it's an interesting idea, right? Which is saying essentially that existence is essentially good. Okay, and it's something that instinctively I think we all sort of know, right? So and so that's the first step. The next step is that, well, when we look at what the good is, we see that the good is fundamentally diffusive. So what do you mean by diffusive? You can think of something that overflows. Okay, so you can think of like a fountain or something like that, right? That just basically sprouts, water or something. So the good is fundamentally diffusive. And that means you think of what something that's good, it's that it gives of itself, right? Um, and so because God is sort of eternal, this diffusiveness is eternal. Okay, it's also necessary, right? So that means you have this sort of eternal cycle of diffusiveness in God but is contained within God, right? And this diffusiveness of the good results in what we call the Trinity of persons. And that Trinity in Christianity is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Right? So step 5 sort of answers the question of what is God. So you learn about the what, and then step 6 is the question of who is God. Right? So at this point, you have made the full journey. That is when you begin to see God, not just in step 1 and 2, that's in the external world, and looking into things and seeing the structure and order of things and seeing God in them. You've also then taken the step to reflect into yourself and seeing the image of God in yourself. And in memory, intellect, and will, you see how God operates, and you see something about God. And now you've come to step 5, where you begin to see God as being, right? Just a fundamental existing thing, that everything exists. So God as creator and source of all. And then from there, you can take this step and you see God as God is in himself, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Okay, and at this point, then, the steps, have all been completed. Okay, and then this leads to chapter 7 in Bonaventure's work, which then is a slightly different chapter. It's no longer about the steps, but it's about the result. What happens at this point? You're sort of at the precipice, right? You've done everything that you can. And then what happens next is we see in chapter 7.